Welcome everyone. Welcome to this session of The Future Scientist. I'm James Barbieri. I'm the Associate Program Director here at the Power Center. I will be your host for today. As a host, I'm here to help you throughout the call. So any problems, technical or not, feel free to just message me in the chat. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Michel Bitbol and Alex Gomez-Marin. Michel is emeritus researcher at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. After starting scientific research, he turned to philosophy of science, editing texts by Schrödinger and studying the relations between physics and the philosophy of mind, as well as a first-person conception of consciousness arising from the experience of the phenomenological. More recently, he engaged in a debate with the philosophical movement called speculative realism, which comes from the same standpoint. We're joined as well with Alex, a theoretical physicist and cognitive neuroscientist and chair of this series. He has a PhD in physics from the University of Barcelona and is Juan de la Sierra Fellow at the Center for Genomic Regulation and current head of Behavior Organism Laboratory at the Instituto de Neurociencia in Alicante. His current research concentrates on consciousness and cognition in humans in real-world situations, combining theoretical biology and continental philosophy. Today, Alex and Michel will be in conversation, drawing from the phenomenological tradition to explore the feasibility of a new kind of science in which human consciousness is placed at the center. Before we begin, though, I'd just like to remind everyone of a couple of guidelines for this call. Firstly, if you could please mute your microphone just to ensure good quality audio, but at the same time, please do keep your camera on. It's really nice to see everyone's faces and the community. During the Q&A and discussion, if you have a question, if you could please use the raise your hand function, which can be found under reactions at the bottom of your screen. And I'll call you out and you can ask your question. Otherwise, if it makes you feel more comfortable, you can use the chat, write your question in the chat, and I can read it out to you. Please do use the chat throughout the session. It's a great way to share your thoughts with the rest of the community about the topics that arise during this conversation. Finally, the session is recorded for archival purposes and will be available in a few days to you all. So you should receive a link once it's ready. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Alex and Michel. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you, James. All right, so it's again an honor to be able to have another installment of the Future Scientist series. And it's a particular joy, and I would say the word joy is accurate, to talk to Michel, with whom I've had conversations before privately. I'm always learning and probably always asking the same questions because in a way they are hard to grasp. And maybe as we will see, they are so intimate and present, but at the same time, difficult to grasp. So I will just kick this off by saying that in these explorations of the future scientist, I'm not very certain of many things, but maybe one thing I would bet on is that the future scientist or the future science will or must draw heavily on phenomenology. And for that, we have really an expert on phenomenology. So I would start, Michel, asking you, what is phenomenology? And probably if you can distinguish between kind of light, medium, and radical takes on phenomenology, and probably we will continue with the radical take of phenomenology, because phenomena is a word that people use, scientists use it. Maybe sometimes a second class, there's mechanism, and then there's phenomena, like something that appears or we want to explain. Of course, that has to do with phenomenology, but there's much more. So I think this is a good point to start. What is phenomenology, Michel?
Thank you, Alex. First of all, I would like to say that I'm also delighted to speak with you, Alex, because I've seen that we have so much in common, and I was delighted to see someone who is of this young generation of scientists who really understands what is at stake in what I like to call, and now people like Evan Thompson are trying to develop on that also, what I like to call the blind spot of science, namely the place in which science cannot go just because it's the condition for its own efficiency and possibility. What is what is beyond any possibility for a scientific study, just its own presuppositions, or its own fundamental presupposition, which is a human being capable of being conscious of what he or she observes on the one side, and what she or he understands on the other side. So this is the fundamental feature of our science. At the same time, an amazing lot of remarkable values and remarkable capability of self-transformation in order, or even almost ascesis for getting the best possible rigorous science ever. And on the other hand, in order to do that, a scientist has to push aside certain elements, which is her own subjectivity, her own values, her own difficulties, and so on and so on. So phenomenology now, phenomenology is precisely the discipline by which the Western philosophy has tried to compensate for this blind spot of objective science. Namely, science is ordering phenomena. It is ordering phenomena usually by mathematics or by logic, according to the disciplines of science, and using this ordering of phenomena in order to predict future phenomena. The problem is that what is missing in this remarkable picture is not, of course, phenomena. It's the very fact of phenomenality, namely the very fact that something appears to someone, namely lived experience. Lived experience is not an object of science, is not an object of any possible objective science. Just because it is not an object, it is the condition of possibility for anything to appear as an object. And therefore, phenomenology was created, at the beginning of the 20th century by a celebrated German philosopher called Edmund Husserl. Edmund Husserl was a mathematician. He was the peak of the best German mathematics of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And he suddenly discovered for himself that mathematics, this remarkable building of ideas, concepts, and operations, was nothing if not a conscious mode of ordering ideas, concepts, phenomena, and any possible phenomena. So he came back to his own lived experience of a mathematician, and he asked the following question: how does mathematics arise from the lived experience of a mathematician? That was his question. And he produced a wonderful work, especially called, a work about the foundations of arithmetics, and another work about the foundation of logic. And he tried to understand how mathematics was elaborated out of our lived experience, but not as, the object of another science called psychology. Because if he understood the genesis of mathematics out of another science called psychology, he would have done nothing, because the whole of science was in need of a foundation. And therefore, he could not ground a science called mathematics on another science called psychology. He had to withdraw from any scientific thought in order to find the locus of the proper foundation of any science whatsoever. And he called that phenomenology. The science of pure experience, but not taken as an object of study as psychology would do, but taken as a departure point of any objective study. I think it is essentially, well, an attempt at characterizing the origin of phenomenology.
Oh, lovely. I already have so many comments or questions. Let's go in order. So how is it practiced? How does one, let's say, all right, this sounds intriguing and important. Now I want to become a phenomenologist. And what's the practice of it? And I'm asking this because then I want to see really how far can it go? And since you said it's been I love this way of explaining it, a way to compensate, that has tried to compensate. I also want to know if this attempt has failed or not, because sometimes I think it has succeeded, sometimes I think it has failed. But to get there, how is phenomenology practiced? Let's say as a scientist or as a non-scientist, okay, I want to be a phenomenologist. What do I do?
Excellent, excellent. Yes, a good question, very direct one. First of all, maybe we can see at how Husserl himself came to phenomenology. How did he modify the methodology of every science, including psychology, to get to phenomenology? It depended on a certain event of his life. At the end of the 19th century, the young Husserl, who was a mathematician, had a religious crisis. He was born a Jew, and he suddenly had a mystical crisis, and he converted to Christianity, to Lutheranism, exactly, the religion which was dominant in Germany at his time. So he underwent this process of what he called a conversion. Suddenly something was modified in his general outlook to life and to his own lived life. And he said the same must be done in order to understand the foundations of mathematics. We have to convert our way of seeing things to bring back our attention from the objects of thought to the lived basis for taking anything as an object. So you have to convert the way of looking at things. You have, well, in order to be very simple, you have to turn your look inwards. But this is a little bit approximative. But to turn your look inwards, you have to do two operations. The first operation is called the epoche. In Greek, that means the suspension, the stopping. Suspension of judgment. This operation called the epoche was advocated by the creators of Greek skepticism, such as Pyrrho, Sextus Empiricus, and so on and so on. And they said, in order to get to ataraxia, namely the rest of the mind, we have to suspend judgment about anything, especially judgment about the existence of objects out there, especially the suspension of judgment about the intrinsic existence of a world that goes beyond experience and that is, so to speak, revealed by the appearances that are seen in experience. So you suspend judgment on anything, and then what do you get? You get just the presence of experience, just that. You don't see a chair, but you suddenly realize that there is experience of a chair. And then when you have done that, when you have done this suspension of judgments, of intellectual and perceptual judgments, then you try to examine the texture of this experience. And it's exactly the procedure I've called turning your look inwards. And it's called the phenomenological reduction by Edmund Husserl. He said, okay, now that you don't, your attention is not too much attracted towards external things, or rather towards things that you deem to be external, now you can examine the granularity of the experience that makes you believe that there are external things. Okay, so then you do this examination carefully, and when you have done that, when you have generalized these descriptions of things, of the experienced things that make you believe in the existence of an external world, then you start to describe this in words. And when you describe this in words, then you are doing what a philosophical phenomenologist is doing every day, namely describing not only his or her own experience, but describing what Husserl called the essence of experience, namely the invariance of a certain type of experience. It's the type of experience that can be shared not only from one time to another of a certain individual, but also from one individual to another individual. And in this case, you do phenomenology. So now you have the method. You can do that, Alex.
Okay, let me iterate on these 3 points, and maybe asking in terms of other familiar words to see if it's the same or if there's something subtle and important where this is different. So this epoche, how is that different from introspection, which was practiced before? Yeah. And we know that when we say introspection or intuition and so on, this can mean many things, right? But introspection was kind of a method, if you wish, proposed by the early psychologists, right? Now, secondly, when you say examine the texture of it, the reduction, how is this similar or different than thinking about those experiences? Because then I'm afraid you start to have abstractions, ideas and concepts and so on, and maybe you already left that state.
Absolutely.
So how is this not introspection? How is this not thinking? And then in the third step, well, it's not the third step, but you said, well, now you describe these things in words. Now, many people would say, well, as you do that, the thing is lost because you're trying to convey things and words are not very good for them. And actually some neuroscientists, friends of mine would say, and better not do it in words because that's how psychologists get lost. But why not do it precisely with mathematics, which is like a better language? Some physicists believe it is the language of the cosmos, right? So how are these 3 steps really? I don't think there are those other concepts. So understanding the subtleties in the distinction, I think would help at least me and perhaps the rest of us.
Good. Thank you for this three questions. 3 questions that means that I have to
I'll remind you, no problem.
So first question, difference between phenomenology and introspection. This was indeed a very important point to understand from the very start of phenomenology. The first book of the logical investigations of Husserl, which is also the first book of phenomenology ever, is devoted to this distinction between introspective psychology on the one side and phenomenology on the other side. Introspective phenomenology is something that you can do without having performed the epoche, because you just examine the objects of your own thought by means of inner examination. It's exactly the meaning of the word introspection, that spection is inspection and intro means inwards. So you inspect the processes of your thoughts by means of a certain inner inspection. But in phenomenology, you do not do that because you start from the epoche, and then you suspend even this attitude of paying attention to something, of directing your stare towards something, and you just suspend anything like that and dwell into this experience which you have recovered by way of the suspension of judgment on any object whatsoever, not only outer objects, but also, inner objects, you know? So this was clearly stated by Husserl from the beginning. And then he explained that you should do what he called the eidetic reduction. This is a complex word, so I have to explain it. That means it's exactly what I explained formerly, namely you have to make imaginative variations around a certain type of experience in order to extract the invariant of this type of experience. And then at that moment, you have extracted what Husserl calls an essence of experience. It's no longer an empirical study of some objectified experience. It's the extraction of an invariant of a large ensemble of experiences. Mm. And this procedure is exactly the same as the one you do when you do mathematics. Mm. When you study, say, the concept of a triangle, you don't want to know a particular triangle drawn on the blackboard. What you want to know is the generic features of the triangle in general. And how can you do that? You research, the invariants that are maintained across all possible triangles that you can examine in your mind. And according to Husserl, you should do exactly the same for the features of experience itself. So Husserl practiced, I would say, introspective phenomenology, but in a way that was deeply modified with respect to the normal methodology of introspective psychology, and which was inspired from mathematics. Mm. So I think this is a real discovery of his, and I think it's interesting. So now we have to go to the other sub-questions.
Yes. Now you convey these, so you convey those, can I call them insights? You convey those invariants you were saying in terms of description of by means of words. That's kind of what you do next, because you may want to communicate that. Otherwise, this sounds like a really nice meditative state, but there has to be some sort of intersubjectivity there, which is another big word that maybe you can unpeel for us. But what I mean is, at some point you need to convey it, especially while doing philosophy, but also if you want to do science with it. So you do it by means of language. How does that work? How limited that is?
Yeah, perfectly right. This is also a problem, the use of language. And Husserl was also very much aware of the biases introduced by language. He knew that when you use language, you use limitative concepts, and then you limit somehow your description of the essences of experience. And therefore, any description of an essence of experience is bound to be partial. And when you witness the presence of experience, you have a deep sense of certainty, absolute certainty. The most absolute certainty you can have is just that the experience is here and now. But when you try to describe the contents of these experiences by means of words, of course, you are extracting a little part of this experience you are living here and now, and this little part is biased. It's only one profile, one aspect of what you are experiencing, and therefore it is claiming validity without any certainty of being valid at all. Mm. Okay. So this was absolutely acknowledged by Husserl. He knew that his knowledge was also partial, just as any knowledge of the scientific type, and certainly not better than that. Now, how do you validate these verbal descriptions of your lived experience, or these verbal descriptions, at least, of the invariance of your lived experience? Just, by a very simple process that appeal to exactly what you said, namely intersubjectivity. When you read Husserl, you have two possible feelings. Either you understand nothing, this is the case of many people, I must say, or exactly the other way around. You read Husserl, and suddenly you have the amazing feeling that this guy has penetrated within your skull. He knows what you are experiencing. He knows what you are feeling here and now. And when you realize how much he understood and described what you are living at this very moment, you know he is right. You recognize the validity of his descriptions by the fact that you have exactly what he describes, that his descriptions are perfectly adequate to describe what you are living at this very moment. This is a criterion that I could call the mutual recognition of lived experience as described by words. When a teacher of meditation sometimes describes you, say, a certain state that you can reach by meditation, they don't do that usually. But when they do that, and suddenly you get to the experience that they are describing, you know that they were right. You say, oh, aha, now I know what he means or what she means, okay? And it's exactly the same in phenomenology. You suddenly know that this person has understood what you are living. And conversely, when you yourself try to describe something to someone, what you wish and what you hope for is that this someone will recognize in his or her own experience what you have described. And in this case, you know that the validity of this description. Now, finally, you asked the question of mathematics. Okay, maybe you can try to use mathematics in the description of certain, essences or invariance of experience. And I must say, as I told you previously, that maybe mathematics is especially adequate to this description, because in fact, the type of method you use in order to extract the essences of experience are exactly the same as in mathematics. Now, Jean Petitot, who is a very good philosopher of science, mathematician, and phenomenologist, who works in Paris and who was my dear colleague, has shown how, in fact, the descriptions of Husserl about the experience, for instance, of seeing a material body from different sides and different profiles, is perfectly isomorphic to geometry, to differential geometry. So the language of Husserl in describing the way you identify a body by way of the multiplicity of its profiles can be translated term by terms in terms of differential geometry. So differential geometry is a perfect language for expressing that, and it has been demonstrated by Jean Petitot in 1999.
All right. So, because I was going to ask you, because you said like all descriptions are going to be partial. And yes, I had the feeling that verbal ones had superior status for phenomenologies, but now you're saying, well, it could be mathematical ones, which leaves the door open to, for instance, these theories of consciousness that are try to do it as a physicist would do it, actually, with, hardcore principles and equations, even combining phenomenology. I'm thinking of integrated information theory, right? For instance, so we still don't know, because I had the feeling that if you start with phenomenology, but then you kind of take off, as Whitehead would say, you take off, you make this leap of abstraction through mathematics. Well, sometimes people never land again, but maybe is a trip that one needs to indulge in, right? From phenomenology to mathematics and back. Would you be supportive of that? Or in the moment you leave concrete experience for abstractions, is there something that's lost and very hard to recover unless kind of you go back to this, I keep calling it like a meditative state, but it really looks like being awake and dreaming or something like that. Like I'm doing my business as a scientist and now I want to practice phenomenology. I go in this state, but then all of a sudden I start thinking, well, I may need some mathematics here. Let's see how it maps. And then I'm in this other state again, which is abstraction. So how does one do that commute, if that commute is advisable at all?
Yes, that's a very good question again. Yes, the very, the initial motivation of Husserl for founding phenomenology was certainly to do the famous conversion of mind and finally getting back to what is most directly dear to us, namely the concreteness of our lived life. So this was the initial motivation. Now, if you want also to communicate that, you need to use a language that has structure. Mm. And the most abstract language that has structure is mathematics. So mathematics can serve as a bridge between the phenomenological study of the structures of experience and the scientific study of the structure of the objective domain. Mm. Okay? So this is a wonderful point of contact between the two. So what is common to experience and to the objective domain, if not structure? And structure is encoded by mathematics. So it's quite normal that mathematics can be the bridge between the two. But we should not think either that when we have elaborated a mathematical language of the invariance or essences of lived experiences, we have exhausted what experience is. It would be just the same mistake as when scientists believe that when they have understood completely the objective world, they have understood everything, including the starting point of the objectification of the world, including the starting point of the scientific inquiry, So Husserl was very diffident of saying that, everything is encoded in mathematics, and this abstraction of ours is able to disclose the secret of everything, including our own experience. This is exactly the contrary of what he thought. And he wrote, a whole book entitled The Crisis of the European Science, to say that saying that the byproduct of our abstraction, namely mathematics, is primary, and that everything else, including our consciousness, including our experience, can be derived from that, is the reason why the European science, namely the Western science, is undergoing serious difficulties, is experiencing serious difficulties, which difficulties, by the way? The famous problems of foundations, namely the Gödel theorem, the problem of measurement in quantum mechanics, the problem of the direction of time in thermodynamics, and so on and so forth. All of these problems are generated by the oblivion of the lived origin of the scientific inquiry and the attempt at taking what is secondary as primary, namely the attempt at taking the byproduct of an abstract construction, such as mathematics, as the starting point of the inquiry and the foundation of everything, including consciousness and lived experience. So according to Husserl, it was something that you should not do. You should not invert the priorities. the priorities are still the priorities of the genesis of science, namely, first, human beings with lived experience who try to orient themselves in an unknown environment, and then progressive extraction of invariants, structures, mathematics, and so on, as a tool for this orientation in the unknown. But this is only a tool. The tool should not be taken as an absolute, ultimate, and primary foundation. This is the warning of Husserl.
I see. So that's quite paradoxical if we think about the future scientist again. Like, let me ask you, how do you see the future scientist? And in concrete, I'll ask you based on what you said. It seems that the future scientist should be more humble and aware of the limitations of science. And that means probably that we need to surrender, give up, and this kind of totalizing aspiration of of theories of everything, of understanding everything, of total unification, of a complete theory of everything, which is in a way what has pushed science. That's kind of an impetus of science, you know, to cover more and more and more landscape of the phenomena, and have this hope, this belief, even this faith that, you know, we may never get to truth and so on, but we will asymptotically converge as we conquer more regions. And now we will unify, you know, electromagnetism, and then we will discover new forces, but then we will put them together and so on. And current physics is at this point where they're trying to reconciliate relativity and quantum mechanics, but the impetus is have a whole theory of everything. But it seems that if you practice phenomenology, you should realize that even if you get at that, you're missing a huge amount, which, by the way, is what humanists always told us, right?
Yeah.
In a way, it's the precaution against scientism. So is this where the future scientists would go if one takes phenomenology at face value? I would say just being more aware of one's limitations. Because that sounds, let me just add one more thing. Sorry, it's a long question, but it's like, I'm just making it in different ways. Because this sounds like bad news, especially in nowadays zeitgeist, which is about progress and more and conquering more, right? This sounds like refrain from this push. Yes.
Okay, so maybe a very simple way to put things to answer your question is to just say that the future scientist should not stop doing what he is doing or she is doing now, by no ways, but just enlarging the field of self-awareness, and understand that seeking the theory of everything or every phenomenon doesn't mean that she or he will get to the theory of everything in the global sense, namely not only everything in, you know, every object and every phenomenon, but even the condition of possibility of this research itself. It's just the problem. It's just knowing that the limitation is not in front of us, scientists, it's backwards of us. It's where we start from. And maybe I can read you a sentence by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who had, of course, understood everything about that. So here is the sentence by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Science, he said, progressively reintroduces what it first excluded as subjective. Okay, so there is the attempt of science at accounting for subjectivity itself, not only for objective things. Okay, I would say the strange attempt of cognitive science of our day is to try to objectify subjectivity. I would say, okay, at least it's exactly what Merleau-Ponty meant here. So science progressively reintroduces what it first excluded as subjective. But science wishes to reintroduce subjectivity as a special case of the relationships and objects that define the world according to science. So that means that science wants to make subjectivity into an object, one more object. And then Merleau-Ponty adds this. Then the world closes on itself. So the attempt of science is to totalize things and to capture everything as a big object. And then the final sentence is crucial. And except by what in us thinks and constructs science, we become parts of the big object. And this is the crucial part, okay? We become parts of the big object. Why? Because cognitive science has transformed us into an object of science. But beware, we are included in the big object, except by what in us thinks and constructs science. The scientist, at this very moment in which he thinks that everything can be objectified, is not included within the big object she or he is trying to capture. So this is exactly the point, you know.
Yes, and I think it's well captured in this image of the blind spot and this physiological fact that no matter how fast and how much you scan with your eye, there'll always be a point at which the light won't get there, like a hole if you want. And I think that's what you're saying, right? Better tools, better knowledge, that's all great, but there's always a point that's blind. And that's the point that phenomenology wants to acknowledge.
And the difficulty, I think, is that this blind spot is not easily characterized. You know, when maybe you could say the blind spot is the mind, but the mind can be defined as a system for processing information. So you say, oh, okay, so it's not exactly the mind, it's something else, maybe consciousness. Okay, but some cognitive scientists would define consciousness as a system of gathering information and reflectively self-monitor information. Then in that case, even consciousness can be objectified. But David Chalmers would say, oh yes, but what about the heart problem? Or Ned Block would say, what about phenomenal consciousness? Not access consciousness, but phenomenal consciousness. So each time you are, each time you are trying to characterize the blind spot is slipping in your hands. But that doesn't mean that the blind spot doesn't exist. It just means that the blind spot is invisible by definition, by construction. And that it's obvious that it eludes any simple definition, okay? But still, it's here. It's maybe it's the most present thing we have at this very moment. There is something that we presuppose and we cannot see.
Yeah. Well, by the way, this gives a lot of material for philosophers to write books.
That's a wonderful thing, yeah.
Let me ask you about evolution and then about quantum mechanics, because I don't want to miss the opportunity, because you're also an expert in an understanding of quantum mechanics, the interpretations, the historical aspects of it, and so on. But before that, evolution, which has to do with speculative realism, which is a view that you've been counterbalancing with phenomenology, if I can say that. Let me put it this way. In this divide between objectivity and subjectivity, very often we hear arguments that are evolutionary or chronological, especially like prominent neuroscientists that want to kind of describe the really beautiful history of animal minds and even plants and bacteria, and then this happened, and then to sensation or detection of abilities of the bacteria, and perception came, and then it gets complex and complex and complex until as humans, and it's still, I would say, a mystery to what extent or how we're different than other animals and so on. But it's painted, well, not as a ladder, because evolution is not stairway, but more as a tree. But the point is, well, if you rewind the movie chronologically, you get to a point where there was no life. And if you rewind further, it's like the universe was in a very primitive soup state. And so this chronological argument is very compelling in kind of demonstrating, quote unquote, that there was a time when there was no subjectivity, unless we want to go into panpsychism and so on, which is also fine. And therefore, objectivity is primary. Therefore, everything we've been saying so far would seem to be, again, the other way around. What's primary is objectivity, in a way, abstraction, if you wish. And experience, human experience, is something that came much later in the story of the universe. So this chronological argument is always bumping into the phenomenological argument. And I must admit, I lean more towards the phenomenological, but it's very hard to argue or have a conversation with somebody that holds the other one, because it seems really like a totally different standpoint, and there seems to be no resolution. So how do you deal with these two competing stories about what is superior to what?
Yeah, of course. When you discuss with someone who tells you the story of the universe and say, look, in a large part of the story of the universe, there were no conscious beings, no human beings, not even living beings, and say, oh, therefore, objective world is primary with respect to consciousness. Then you have to ask this person to make a conversion of attitude. So just suddenly say, oh, yes, your story is wonderful. I think it accounts for a lot of phenomena that can be observed here and now in our environment. It can account for, the photons that are collected by our telescopes. It can account for fossils. It can account for everything. And this story is compelling. It can even be said to be true in the best sense of the word. So I agree with them. But please, just now that you have understand that it's a story that enables you to organize the phenomena you are witnessing at this very moment. And it's a story that you are telling me now. Now come back where you stand, namely in your own present experience. And please understand, realize that all this story is a story that you are telling now. All this story is a story that accounts for present evidence. In your present awareness of all the evidence that has been gathered by paleontology, astrophysics, and geology in the past. It's now that you are convinced of that. And the condition of possibility for this very story is that you as a subject are thinking of it now. It's very simple. It's just a gesture of conversion. Suddenly say, okay, I am now building this story for the sake of explanation. And I must understand this as an explanatory tool. Okay? So now, of course, you have two standpoints. You have the standpoint of the phenomenologist, who suddenly realizes where she or he stands, namely in the present experience, and you have the story of the scientist. And is one story to be taken more seriously than the other? I would say neither of them. The best attitude towards these two stories is to accept that they work as a sort of Ouroboros-like loop, namely, a circular loop, a strange loop, as Douglas Hofstadter says. Namely, you as a thinking and experiencing subject can be located in the story that you are telling. And at the same time, the story that you are telling is your story. It exists here and now in your experience and in your mind. So you are both located in this story as a human body, okay? This human body, this living body has a certain position in the story of the universe. And at the same time, the whole story, including your body, is located within the space of your mental coordinates at present. You know, so there is a loop here. Yes. One encompasses the other, and conversely.
You know, what comes to mind, at least to me, often is yes, but. And then let me just insist here, because, and I don't like playing the devil's advocate, it's kind of tiring, but so I'll just be honest with my yes and my but. And the but is, one could say, well, you say very beautiful, the Ouroboros, and like 2 stories, but come on, I have a fossil record and I have my background microwave radiation. You know, it's like, this is hardcore evidence. And sure, you have this beautiful way of going back to experience, but I have the fossil record. I mean, I have all this data that it's, I mean, what you conclude from it, as we know in science, it can never be 100% certain, because you may find something else later that just turns the whole picture upside down. But it seems true, as true as it can get, that millions of years ago, there was no human mind in the universe, unless you want to go to theology, which is also great, and imagine that the universe is the mind of God and God in the universe and so on. And when I say God, I don't mean, you know, the old man with a beard in the sky. I mean something more serious. But in any case, there's always a yes, but. And this brings me to something you said before, which is very interesting when you were talking about the mutual recognition, that at that moment, it seems to me there's a bifurcation where the people we're talking to, we either don't get it, as you just said, yeah, or you recognize it as totally right. But there seems to be no middle way. It's not like, okay, maybe 60%. It's like, no, I don't get it, because the mind, maybe it's abstraction, says, come on, and we know for sure that there was a time when there was no life and no mind in the universe, and you're telling me to take these 2 stories as with equal weight, and I won't accept it, right? That would be a typical answer, I suppose.
But you know, I can accept that the whole story is true, just as any scientific theory is at least claiming truth. And it can, of course, be tested against future experiments and so on. I perfectly accept that with no problem. But you have to understand that even the concept that there was a time in which there was no human consciousness makes sense only now in a certain human consciousness. And this is just as incontrovertible as the truth that is very strong and very strongly founded in hard evidence.
Yeah,
perfectly right.
Yeah,
right.
That's probably why we are trained, at least as physicists, with what I call the yoga of objectivity, and we end up believing that there's really a view from nowhere, which is something you've written extensively about, a view from nowhere where like the equations are carved in stone, in a way maybe as a explicit depiction that even if we all die, the equations are still there running the universe. So in a way, they don't need our subjectivity to talk about or to rule the cosmos. Well, it's a very difficult topic.
Certainly, they don't need any particular subjectivity.
Nothing. Yes.
They don't need any particular subjectivity to hold. Even if I die, they hold. But without any possibility of being recognized by anyone, they don't hold, because they are a way to organize a certain pattern of phenomena that has been obtained by human activity. We should never forget that.
Yes, that reminds me of some analogy that Ian McGilchrist puts, and it's been widely used, of course, which is music. that it could be written down, but until one listens to it, it's not recreating itself, right? So in a way, that's when it actually takes place.
Exactly. You can write music as much as you want. If no one plays it and no one hears it, it's not music. It's a set of dead marks on paper. And it's exactly the same for mathematical equations. They need to be, they need to have an interpreter and to have someone who check them against new facts, against new experimental facts obtained by new experimental work, and so on and so on. So we need them to, in order for the mathematics to be valid, they have to be made living. We have to help them live. If not, they are just marks on paper or marks on the computer. That's it.
Lovely. Okay, let me close this with another difficult and long to answer question, but I'm sure during the discussion and question and answers, these topics will emerge again. I mean, the time has flown so quickly, Michel, because as always, I mean, I have this full of notes. It's amazing, like notes. Okay, now evolution helps me at least to exercise what phenomenology is in terms of time. Now, quantum mechanics helps me kind of stress test my understanding of phenomenology in terms of space, or at least in terms of this idea of the world out there, whether it is out there, independent of me, and so on. Now, many things have been said about quantum mechanics, and to me, it's amazing that such a revolution 100 years later, it's kind of neglected by many physicists, especially biologists, and also maybe, well, pluralism is always good. There are all these interpretations, but maybe the picture is sold as, well, again, there are these equations, just shut up and calculate. And then there's this kind of exuberant way of just making sense of them. And a priori, we don't know what is true about those interpretations. But I'm sure you have your preferred interpretations and also your take, even metaphysical, but scientific only would be good enough, about what quantum mechanics actually did to science, what they did to science, and what they really mean in the light to phenomenology.
Yes, maybe I can, interpretations of quantum mechanics are so many, but I think there are invariants to these interpretations. Namely, any interpretation can reach a certain conclusion on which all the other interpretations would agree. And there is one I would like to stress, that we cannot be separated from the world. This is a conclusion that anyone would agree with, including the realist hidden variables that, for instance, in Bohm's hidden variable theory, you have a sort of holistic picture in which any attempt at measuring something from within the world will modify the trajectory of the particles, even though these trajectories exist intrinsically. If you do something to measure them, they will be modified. So you cannot completely disentangle with the world, with the environment, even though you can have a sort of distantiated picture according to hidden variable theory. So the difference between hidden variable theory, namely the most realist interpretations of quantum mechanics, and the non-realist interpretations of quantum mechanics is not about this issue of non-separability between the observer and the observed. This one is absolutely constant across interpretation. But it's about the possibility or not of getting a sort of outer picture of the whole process. If you believe that you can have an outer picture of the process of interaction between the observer and the observed, then you are a realist. If you believe that there is no way of getting an outer picture of the interaction between the observer and the observed, then you are close to the Copenhagen interpretation, or the later interpretations such as information theoretic interpretations, or cubist interpretation, quantum Bayesianist interpretation. But all these people, I can tell you again and again, all these people agree that the main feature of quantum mechanics is that we cannot disentangle ourselves with the world we explore. This is the point. So objectification cannot be performed to the very end of it. Objectification has a limit. It cannot be pushed towards its completion. And if we have understood only this point, it's crucial.
And beautiful, isn't it, that by trying to figure out how matter behaves at the smallest energy scales, we, in a way, come back full circle with what would happen if you would be studying what happens to mind. In a way, you would come to the same realization. Maybe that's why quantum mechanics and consciousness studies are brought together sometimes, not necessarily talking about microtubules and so on, but where you end along this path is this similar realization.
Absolutely. It's certainly, to clarify things, quantum mechanics cannot be said to be a theory of the mind, by no ways. But it's a theory in which you suddenly realize for the first time, even if you refuse it, even if you make desperate attempts to avoid that conclusion, you realize that you as a whole, namely as an explorer, as an agent, as Christopher Fuchs would say, cannot be disentangled from the process you explore. Namely, you cannot describe particles and waves as if they were completely independent of what we do in order to manifest them, to make them manifest in a lab. So it doesn't describe the mind. Quantum mechanics does describe the mind, but it shows you that you cannot completely eliminate this from the picture.
Beautiful. Yes. Okay, let me finish with one more comment. Is that okay, James? Are we good on time? Yes, okay. So I tend to go back to the future scientist, how it may look like, but let me ask you about the future phenomenologist. What work is there to be done in phenomenology? You would say, well, the personal one, because you're asking me for more homework, but you haven't still practiced epoche, right? And probably that's a fair enough answer. But what's the work that you think needs to be done, if any, to bring phenomenology further? Or maybe that's as good as it gets and as it is, and let's just practice more epoche and everything will be much better.
Maybe what I could show as a direction of work in phenomenology can be explained or understood by way of a famous Zen story, you know, a story by a Zen master. The story is very simple. At the beginning, certainly you know this story is very simple, but it's very difficult to understand. At the beginning, there are mountains and rivers. Then when you start practicing Zen, there are no more mountains and rivers. And at the end of the day, when you have fully realized, you know, the satori or the scope of the Zen practice, mountains are again here, and rivers appear again. Okay. For phenomenology, it's exactly the same. At the beginning, in Husserl's practice of the epoche, suddenly the world disappears. You are left with pure experience of a world. And then the more you go, the more you realize that even this belief in things out there are parts of your experience. And then you progressively restore everything, but with a completely different meaning. So the experience you have become very close to the experience of an ordinary human being, an ordinary scientist, but the meaning is, and the flavor is different, okay? And it's exactly what Husserl says in the Cartesian meditation. He said, I must lose the world by the epoche in order to recover the world by way of a universal awareness of myself. Okay, so you lose the world and then you recover the world, but by way of a universal awareness of yourself. So when you see the history of phenomenology, it's exactly what happened. Namely, at first, there was a sort of idealistic suspension of judgment and the claim that only consciousness is the absolute. It's exactly more or less what Husserl said in 1930. And then the more you go, the more you, for instance, you go to Heidegger, to Sartre, to Merleau-Ponty, to Michel Henry, to Renaud Barbaras, and all these people. And the more you see refined description of things that are amazingly similar to everyday experience. Okay, and they are no longer recognized as purely an idealistic description of consciousness. Okay, so I think the horizon of phenomenology is recognizing the full content of experience, including the usual mistake of everyday human beings and standard scientists, namely the forgetfulness of experience. Even that can be described.
That's a perfect point to end, I would say, with the invitation for anamnesis, transformation or conversion, as one practices it. Very good. Okay. Well, thank you, Michel.
Thank you very much.
James.
Thank you so much, both of you, Michel and Alex. It's been such a thought-provoking conversation, which I'm sure everyone has many questions about. So yes, we can open up now to everyone. We do have about 15 to 20 minutes of question and answer. So we would like to give everyone the opportunity to ask their questions. If you can please keep your questions short and focused. And also if you can reserve any follow-ups until everyone's had the opportunity to participate, then we can circle back to you if you've got the time. I can see Carol already has her hand up, so we'll.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Anyway, that was absolutely wonderful. And I think the end may have actually answered my question. So I'm just going to go for a very, very simple question. And I want to know whether it seems to you to be important. As someone who's done some cognitive science and meditation, my experience is this idea of suspending judgment is an idealized, it's an ideal, but the reality is that it seems to me that experience is one of the things that constantly affects experience before you even get to, the invariances of science. So how does anybody, you address the difficulties in suspending judgment? Like, what does suspending judgment even mean, given the way we're embedded in a world and we have the views that we have? What would neutrality even look like?
I don't know what neutrality may look like, just because in order to describe it, you have to use concepts and words, and this is the difficulty. So the only possibility of getting at it is, be invited by all this discourse of phenomenologists and also Zen practitioners or yoga practitioners and so on. Just be invited to do that, not knowing exactly what it means, but just having a suggestion of what it might look like if you performed it, and try it. And I would say, from time to time, in a glimpse, in a little, maybe half second, split second, something strange happens. And you say, oh, maybe that's it.
Okay, so,
And then when you say that, when you say maybe that's it, it's already too late. You're already out of it.
yeah, no, I understand that. So you have an experience and then you're looking for invariances, you share it with someone. You struggle with you have the sense that the language, as you said, only catches a bit of it. You do your best. Then you speak to someone else. They also with language meet you. So you have an aha moment, but can you say that that aha moment is an actual seeing? Or if you take it, if you continue like a series of these, are you sure you're not actually building the world rather than seeing the world? Like the experience and the building come together. How can you speak about that?
There is absolutely no certainty whatsoever about that. And so that's the reason why, any spiritual realization is not based on verbal agreement. It's not based on, on the claim of someone of having been in that state, because there is no proof of that, absolutely no proof. But there is, I think, in the best spiritual teaching, there is a moment of mutual recognition, namely a moment in which the eyes in the eyes, suddenly you realize, yes, we are now in this state, and that's it, and there is nothing to say about it. Okay, and from time to time, I must say that maybe each of us maybe have had something like that. But when I have been in such state for a split second, sometimes for 1 or 2 times for 2 minutes, I had no doubt. But maybe I was wrong. I must say, maybe I was wrong. Okay.
But maybe not. And yeah, like when you think about what Boehm's discussion of dialogue, to me, that's opening up the possibility, like actually actively opening a space for that to happen. Anyway, I will stop asking because I could ask another 16 questions, but I want someone else to have a turn. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol, for your contribution. Next, we'll go to Niels and then Hugh.
Okay, thank you for all your chatting and abstractions and moving here and moving there and trying to, for me, the real problem is actually what I call complexity. I'm thinking about, it was Stephen Hawking who talked about the mind of God in his little book, A Brief History of Time. And from my own perspective and my own understanding, I'm not a physicist, but I do understand physical things. I'm a structural engineer, and I've been doing computer science for the last 50 years. For me, I could talk a lot about something that would fill the gap of the totality and always fill that gap with an irreducible system of understanding, what I would call the mind of God. So if I ask you, how do you see the phenomena of the mind of God?
The mind of God, wow. I don't know. The word God is a word that is so loaded by so many
yes.
that I have difficulty speaking of it without referring to one or the other tradition. Maybe when the most interesting thing that has been said about the mind of God was said by the best mystics, especially of the West. People like Master Eckhart, for instance.
Yes.
When they speak of the mind of God, they speak of a mind that is devoid of any personal identity and also of determination of whatsoever. Any determination cannot be ascribed to this mind of God. Okay. any determination is too much, because any determination encloses something and limits something, whereas this mind of God to which you might arrive at by a proper contemplative discipline is something which is limitless and devoid of any definition, of any limitation, any characteristics, and which is rich of any possibility. That's what the reason why, for instance, Nicholas of Cusa called God possessed, which means the possibility of everything without actuality of anything in particular. So, okay, now this is just quotation. I know nothing about that. I'm just quoting the best authors in mystical issues. I know maybe Master Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa are two excellent authors I would recommend on that.
Yes.
Okay.
I have the answer to it, but it's too far to go into it here now.
Thank you.
James, just to add, so there, I'm also trying to learn something of what's going on with theology today. And there are two living theologists, well, three, well, more, but two groups that are especially relevant, at least to me. One is David Bentley Hart, and he also writes novels. David Bentley Hart has a book called The Experience of God. It's just fascinating for someone to explain what gods mean, but as a professional, not as a mockering kind of pop scientist or anything, like a professional. So David Bentley Hart, I would recommend. And then there's the group of process theologians that draw from Whitehead. So there's John Cobb, who's 98, I think, and then David Griffin. And they also have fascinating works on how to understand God from a process relational point of view, and just to get you interested on it. So these attributes that we give, like omnipotence and omniscience and so on, well, from a process relational point of view, maybe that God would not have that. So these are examples of actually living theologians, and reading that is always very interesting and important to me, because we've been told such a straw-man version of what God is, that you need professionals that really know all the literature to kind of help us unlearn that.
Maybe just to connect theology and phenomenology, I would like to quote a sentence by Master Eckhart again. He says, "The eye by which God is seeing you is the same eye as the one by which you are seeing him." Okay, so I think the standpoint of the phenomenologist is not so different from the standpoint of the theologian, at least from the standpoint of the extreme theologian in the style of deepest mystics.
Beautiful. Thank you, Alex and Michel. Next, we'll go to Hugh.
Oh, yeah, really interesting. Would you say that phenomenology is a form of idealism or not?
Thank you. If I quote Husserl, Edmund Husserl, first of all, I must say many people think that the Husserl of the late 1910s is an idealist. Now, if I quote Husserl himself, he said, yes, maybe what I'm claiming is something like idealism, but it's not the kind of idealism that would claim the existence of the mental domain as opposed to the existence of the material domain. It's the kind of idealism you arrive at just by dwelling where you are and just recollecting in the truth of what you are at this very moment. So it's not a dogmatic or metaphysical idealism, but it's a methodological idealism, because the best evidence you can have about anything, including about the so-called external world, is grounded on present experience. So go back to this body of evidence, and then maybe you can say something else about something that is not reducible to experience. But even this discourse about something that is not reducible to experience is grounded in experience. And that's what Husserl wanted us to understand. So
yeah, okay.
Maybe it's a methodological idealism. Now, when you see the evolution of phenomenology, it's less and less idealistic. For instance, there was the famous subjectivist phenomenology, namely non-subjectivist phenomenology of Jan Patočka, which was taken over by further thinkers such as Bruno Barbaras and so on. So they accept that this experience that is the most evident thing we have is not necessarily to be thought as the experience of someone. Someone is a construction from this experience, just as much as the objects are constructions from this experience. And therefore, there is no solipsism in this priority of experience. And there is not even idealism, because idealism means that you prioritize the mental side rather than the material side. Whereas this continuum in which you are dwelling is no more mental than physical. It is neutral. And therefore, I would say that phenomenology is maybe closer to neutral monism than to idealism.
Okay. Yeah, and the idea of this self evolving from it's quite Buddhist as well, I suppose, isn't it? This idea of the conditions of experience that then produce the self. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for coming in. Now we do have a couple of minutes, so just to sort of start to close this session, I'd just like to ask both of you what, sort of to summarize something, bring away from this session, what would that be? Michel?
Maybe I could. Alex is
Okay,
better.
I'll start as a student of Michel. Well, to me, summary, let's say the brief history of science, as we know it, it's like a good 400 years, 350 years of perhaps saying, well, yes, let's use our experience to find out how things work objectively. And this has been a beautiful arc, but then at some point it stumbled onto some foundational walls like quantum mechanics and so on. And so in this journey, like a child developing, one realizes that that very move that enabled the whole project now needs to be recognized and integrated. And so that's my kind of evolutionary view of what phenomenology brings to the table. It's like this kid that's become a teenager and thinks it knows everything, and now becoming an adult and saying, yes, but I could do that because of what my parents provided in a way. So now I can acknowledge the blind spot, and now I can become a more mature scientist. That's how I would summarize it.
Absolutely. I think it's very good summary. And it's exactly that. It's not that scientists should renounce doing what they are doing, because it's really beautiful. It's full of, of deep values, of rigor, of ascesis, of personal transformation in order to do the best, in order to be sure that nothing has been forgotten, and so on. So it's a beautiful human practice, but which just has to be made adult, namely just aware of its own limitations, and that's it. And in that case, we'll do even better science. And as Alex told us, the whole story of the science of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century is exactly that, stumbling at every point on the limitations of a certain totalizing view of science. It's not a limitation of science, it's a limitation of a totalizing conception of science. And I could conclude by a quotation from the specialist of quantum mechanics, Asher Perez. Asher Perez, in a famous paper called "Is Quantum Mechanics Universally Valid?" concluded this. He concluded, I quote, "Quantum mechanics can describe anything, but it cannot describe everything." No, anything. That means that any object you can take can be an object of quantum mechanics, but not the whole, because the whole includes yourself, and that's the point. Not, of course, the objective whole also can be an object for science, but the real whole, namely the whole that includes yourself, cannot. And that's exactly what Perez concluded by a careful study of the conditions of possibility for elaborating quantum mechanics.
Great. Well, what a beautiful way to end this. Thank you so much, both of you. Alex, thank you for organizing this session. And Michel, it's been amazing to have you today. And of course, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for those who contributed in the chat or asked their questions or just by sitting there and listening to us. Before we go, I just like to announce something. Basically, this is the first time we're announcing it. It's our next month-long series here at the Power Center online, which starts in May. We are currently living through dangerous and turbulent times, so we thought that the Power Center would bring forward this series entitled Love in the Time of Crisis, From Separation to Interbeing. In this series, we'll be exploring a way to navigate a course through the bitter divisions, rivalries, hostilities to unity, cooperation, and civility, even love. Can we recognize that our consciousness is incoherent and that there is a mediating presence, evolutionary love? This series will run from the 7th of May to the 29th on Saturday and Sundays, and will include guests such as Satish Kumar, John Briggs, Mark Vernon, Rabbi Sami Zafiro, and Vincent Colapietro. More information will be on our website early next week. But in the meantime, it's been wonderful to be here with you all today, and we'll see you again soon here at the Power Center.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bye.
It's been delightful to talk to you, Michel. Thank you for your clarity and your generosity as always.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Alex, and thank you.
Thank you so much.